When we look at the relationship of the bureaucracy to the other policymaking institutions, one of the things that you'll find is that sometimes it's though the bureaucracy is like a fourth branch of government. And part of that has to do with the fact that there are a lot of things that happen in the structure that make it so that everyone's kind of jockeying for control of the bureaucracy. Most surely they are part of the executive branch, and please don't ever say anything otherwise. But it's fair to kind of talk about, like, what are the things that are there that help to foster this independent nature. So this diagram kind of shows you some ways that the bureaucracy is under the control of Congress. Part of it up here, when we look at this box, is the idea that Congress is in charge of the organizational structure. The president can request certain things, and he or she is most assuredly in charge of the executive office of the presidency. But in terms of like cabinet organization and where things are going to fall, Congress decides that. So for example, after 9/11, President Bush, he created an Office of Homeland Security, and then Congress saw fit to elevate that to a cabinet status. So they're going to work together, but Congress really plays a huge role in that. Probably the most powerful is the budgetary process. Congress holding the purse strings means that bureaucratic agencies are subject to answering to Congress. And if they want things, ultimately they're going to have to make sure that Congress really understands why they should financially support them. Congress passes the statutes or the laws. So that in essence is telling the bureaucracy, this is what I want you to do. If they write those laws in a very specific manner, Congress doesn't have a lot of discretion. If they write those in a very vague manner, Congress has significant discretion. So that relationship right there can certainly dictate how much discretion the bureaucracy is going to have. Congress is in charge of the confirmation process. Really specifically, remember the Senate. Every secretary and the Attorney General in charge of the Justice Department, high-ranking people in regulatory agencies like the Director of the EPA, the FBI, the Federal Reserve, all of them have to be confirmed by the Senate, which means that they do too have to answer to Congress. And then finally, we cannot forget the oversight function. You guys are going to see an example of that in class. But Congress, as our representatives, have a right to call bureaucrats in to testify. And that is increasingly common. It's a huge way that Congress can kind of assert itself and really kind of make a public display of the way that they're trying to influence the bureaucracy. Well, what about the president? Well, part of the president is the fact that the president is technically their boss. But because of the size of the executive branch, it would be really difficult for the president to micromanage what they do. So here are some ways that he can control them. The fact that the president has immediate access to the media and can go public and do that very effectively, that is one way that he can have more control over what the bureaucracy does. The president can issue an executive order, which, remember, carries the weight of law. And typically an executive order is going to be directed at a cabinet or some type of bureaucratic agency, giving them instructions about how they're supposed to be carrying out the law. The president can use patronage. Remember I said earlier, this is more about appointing people who are like-minded and people that are part of your inner circle, your circle of trust, the people who are going to be carrying things out the way you want them to carry them out. The president can use the appointment process. So by appointing people who are like-minded, you don't have to micromanage because you can appoint people who are going to carry out policy the way you, the president, want things to be done. This whole idea of the institutionalized presidency is just the fact that when the president walks in the room, people stand up. You know, if you look at our last two presidents, they could not be more different people. And they enjoy very different support from different kinds of people and different groups of people. And yet, I would argue that most rational people who have respect for our institutions and respect for our history would stand up the minute either of those men walked in the room because they carry the weight of the presidency. There's some level of history that comes along with that. So as a result, cabinet secretary, director of the FBI, CIA, things like that, they are more likely to fall in line with the president out of respect for the legacy that job comes with. Think how few people have held that position. So it's monumental in terms of our history, and as such really allows them to influence what the bureaucracy does. There's accountability of the courts too, because we still have this whole idea of judicial review. If somebody feels like a bureaucracy has not effectively carried out the law, or that there's been some kind of damages, bureaucrats are subject to legal inspection just like anybody else is. And there are times that agencies have had to adjust their policy due to judicial review. So that definitely is going to play a role. So how do we empower the bureaucracy then? Well, there are some ideas out there, or some terms out there that you can kind of use interchangeably. When I say the word quasi in either one of these, I mean kinda is what that means. So quasi-legislative means, in what way are bureaucrats kind of like lawmakers? When are they allowed to use some kind of administrative discretion? Well, sometimes rules and laws and statutes are written in a vague kind of way. Legislators might do that because of the compromise process that happens in lawmaking. They might do it on purpose because they themselves are not sure exactly what they want the policy to look like. They might do it because they don't want to get blamed for bad policy. So what that does is that gives the bureaucracy then significant authority in terms of how to carry that policy out. I can think about my times as a teacher. There are times when administratively decisions have been made and policies have been made that are kind of vague. So then as a teacher, that gives me some kind of leeway in terms of how I'm going to enforce that. Clearly, the more leeway a bureaucrat has, the more discretion they have. The more strict a policy is written, the less discretion they have. In terms of being kind of like judges or using their discretion when they're trying to adjudicate something, that means that sometimes bureaucrats have to make a call. It's sometimes that bureaucrats have to decide, well, what would be most fair? There are a lot of times where, a street level bureaucrat might be administering a policy and they don't have a lot of wiggle room and they have to do just what the standard operating procedure is. But their boss or their boss or their boss probably has more discretion. And so sometimes they're able to see the gray and to make some kind of adjustment and policy changes. So it's not that bureaucracy makes law, and it's not that bureaucrats are judges, but it's just that in the administration of policy, we very often have unelected people who really are able to use their discretion in terms of how they're carrying and enforcing policy. So what do we hope you'll remember? Well, first of all, you got to realize that bureaucracy is just inevitable. There is no way that you can have such a large system with such an incredible scope, carrying out so many different tasks, and not have this sense of specialization, this sense of compartmentalization. It's a necessary consequence of growth. I myself see it, having worked in Frisco ISD now this is my 14th year. I can totally see how, as the school district has grown, our bureaucracy has had to grow. Has it impacted me as an employee? I mean, it definitely has, positively and negatively. The reality is, though, you cannot have a system, you can't have a one-room schoolhouse anymore. You can't have one teacher that's responsible for everything making all those decisions when there are so many people and the expectation is so high. So by the same token, we can't have a federal government where a few people are making all those decisions. It just doesn't work anymore. When we look at bureaucrats or civil servants, it's natural that they take what we call an agency point of view. In that, if you are an employee or you are somebody that works at the Department of State or the Department of Health and Human Services, or you work for the Environmental Protection Agency, you tend to get focused on your area of policy. You become an expert in that policy. You develop relationships with lobbyists and the press that are all kind of focused on that area of policy. So when I say you take an agency point of view, you simply are seeing things from your perspective and you're promoting what makes sense to you. I've frequently told you that I, as a social studies teacher at Centennial High School, whenever I'm asked to advise Dr. Matthews or someone in the district about policy, I can't help but take a social studies teacher perspective because that's what I know. And that's what I feel is my responsibility to protect and advance. It doesn't mean I don't care about the other things, but it means that my perspective is probably not as global as, say, an administrator, because their job is to protect the entire school. They just take a different perspective. All right, so remember, too, that although all of our agencies are subject to oversight, they have incredible discretion depending on what their level is and depending on what area of policy they oversee.
Part of that comes from our favorite, iron triangles. So remember that in these subgovernments, now that we've created this final part, bureaucrats play an essential role in this iron triangle relationship. In their relationship with Congress, when Congress passes a law, it's up to them to figure out, well, how are we going to execute the law? How are we going to carry that out? Rarely is a policy so prescriptive that a bureaucrat gets told exactly what to do. And so we really have some bureaucrats who are relying on Congress. So that relationship with Congress then can help them to have some kind of direction. In terms of their relationship with interest groups, how do we enforce the law? You know, most certainly bureaucrats have to pick and choose. Everyone is spread thin these days in the workplace. Most people have more responsibility than is feasible to be able to carry out, and bureaucrats are no exception. You cannot expect for a second that the Internal Revenue Service is able to monitor every tax report that comes in and every tax filing that comes in. So it's up then to decide how are they going to regulate. And so the relationship with with interest groups can definitely result sometimes in special favors or regulations being enforced differently than they probably would be if that interest group does not have that special relationship. All right, you have one final question to answer. If for whatever reason you still have question about bureaucracy, I believe chapter 9 in your textbook covers the bureaucracy. It's going to go over most of the things that Coach Thompson and I have talked about. In class, we are going to do a lot of practice and make sure that you have good examples of all of these things that we discussed, and hopefully this has been helpful. If you have any questions, make some notes and please come into class ready to ask us. Bye-bye.